Be sitting down, because what I'm about to tell you could change everything you thought you knew about the car market and your financial future. Over the past few years, car prices have skyrocketed to levels that made even the most seasoned buyers scratch their heads in disbelief. You've probably heard people bragging about how their used cars were worth more than they paid for them, how dealers were begging to buy them back, and how people were essentially driving for free. It seemed too good to be true. Well, that's because it was. What if I told you that we are now standing on the edge of an unprecedented automotive disaster, a collapse that will wipe out billions in value almost overnight? A flood of more than 5 million vehicles is about to hit the market, and it's going to send shockwaves through the entire industry. That's right, millions of cars once considered valuable assets are now rapidly becoming worthless liabilities. This isn't just a normal market correction, this is a financial tsunami that will erase the gains of the past few years and leave millions of Americans with nothing but massive debt. We're talking about rental fleets being dumped by the thousands, leases ending with cars worth far less than their promised value, and repossessions flooding the market in record numbers. Right now, the auto industry is on the brink of a collapse. Rental giants like Hertz and Enterprise are offloading their vehicles at a mind-boggling pace. 110,000 vehicles per month. Lease returns are piling up, and every week over 200,000 cars are hitting the auction blocks. The result? Prices are plummeting and dealers can't get rid of cars fast enough. But here's the real kicker. The ones who created this mess knew it was coming all along. That's right. Banks and auto lenders were aware of this impending collapse as early as mid-2023. They saw the writing on the wall, a 25 to 40% drop in used car values by the end of 2025. But instead of warning the public or preparing for a soft landing, they doubled down, pushing longer loans and higher interest rates on cars they knew would soon be worth a fraction of what people were paying for them. And the worst part? They are already positioning themselves to profit from this collapse. While millions of consumers are going to be left holding the bag, these companies are planning to make billions off the very crash they engineered. This isn't just some unfortunate side effect of the market. It's a calculated strategy designed to extract maximum profit, leaving you, the consumer, to deal with the fallout. But it's not all doom and gloom. Understanding how we got here and who's behind it is your first step to surviving and even profiting from this catastrophe. Because while millions of cars are about to lose their value, those who understand the game and have the financial discipline to weather the storm may just find themselves in a position to make a fortune as others panic. In this video, we'll break down the truth behind the massive collapse in used car values, how it all happened, and most importantly, how you can protect yourself before it's too late. The car market is about to change forever, and you need to be ready. Let's dive in. The rise in used car prices over the past few years has been nothing short of astronomical. What seemed like an anomaly at first soon turned into an undeniable trend, with car prices surging in ways that no one could have predicted. If you were lucky enough to have bought a used car during the height of the pandemic, you might have found yourself in the strange position of owning a vehicle worth more than what you initially paid. Dealers were calling, begging to buy back cars, and in some cases people were selling their vehicles for a profit just a few months after purchase. It wasn't just a few isolated incidents. This was happening across the nation. In 2021, the average used car price hit an all-time high of $28,000, 0 cents, an increase of 40% from pre-pandemic levels. It felt like a golden era for car owners, as if owning a vehicle was some kind of financial windfall. For many, it was a dream come true, but as we all know, what goes up must come down. The problem is, no one could have anticipated just how quickly things would change or how deeply the collapse would affect those who were caught in the frenzy. The foundation of this sudden spike in used car values was built on a series of interconnected factors, starting with the global supply chain crisis that began in 2020. As the world shut down, auto manufacturers were unable to secure the necessary parts to continue production at normal levels. At the same time, demand for cars skyrocketed as consumers, who were now working from home, sought out personal vehicles to avoid public transportation. The chip shortage in particular left automakers scrambling to meet demand for new cars, which led to a massive shortage of new vehicles. With fewer new cars available, more and more people turned to the used car market, driving prices even higher. What was once a buyer's market quickly became a seller's paradise. The combination of pent-up demand and low supply created the perfect storm. But it wasn't just the pandemic that created this unprecedented situation. The financial policies of the big automakers and lenders also played a role. Banks, eager to keep the economy moving, started offering long-term loans at incredibly low interest rates, some stretching as long as 7 years. In fact, the average car loan term in 2022 reached a record high of 72 months, with many consumers willing to take on massive debt to secure a car that had suddenly become a prized asset. The thinking was simple. Car prices were rising, so why not stretch the loan term and make the monthly payments more manageable? After all, the value of the car would only continue to increase, right? For a time, it seemed like everyone was winning. Except they weren't. Fast forward to the present, and the picture is dramatically different. What was once an automotive market fueled by optimism and speculation is now showing signs of breaking under its own weight. Prices are starting to fall, and the reality is sinking in. Many of those who bought cars at inflated prices are now stuck with vehicles that are worth far less than they paid for them. This is where the real problem begins. The automotive bubble that was inflated by supply chain disruptions, low interest loans, and artificially high demand is now bursting. The very same vehicles that were once worth more than their original price are now losing value at an alarming rate. Some experts predict that used car prices could drop by as much as 30% over the next year, while others are even more pessimistic, forecasting a 40% decline in values by 2025. If you were fortunate enough to sell your car during the peak of the market, you likely came out ahead. But for the millions of Americans who bought cars during the frenzy, the sudden decline in value could be financially devastating. As car prices plummet, so too does the equity many consumers thought they had. Vehicles that once seemed like valuable assets are now becoming nothing more than financial anchors, pulling people deeper into debt. It's a situation that could have been avoided, or at least mitigated, if the signs of a bubble had been recognized earlier. But the collapse in used car values isn't just a result of market forces and supply chain disruptions. The truth is, the big players in the automotive industry saw this coming. Manufacturers, lenders, and financial institutions were well aware that the market couldn't sustain the inflated prices for long. They knew that eventually the bubble would burst. But rather than preparing for the inevitable downturn, they continued to fuel the fire, pushing longer loans, offering higher interest rates, and selling overpriced vehicles to unsuspecting consumers. Why? Because in the short term it was profitable. The big banks made billions on auto loans, while automakers enjoyed record profits. They knew the crash was coming, but they also knew they could weather the storm. It was the consumers caught up in the frenzy who would be left holding the bag. This is where the true depth of the crisis becomes clear. The automotive industry didn't just stumble into this situation, they engineered it. And now, with the collapse of used car values inevitable, millions of Americans are facing a financial crisis that was entirely preventable. But what they didn't know at the time, and what they're only beginning to realize now, is that the vehicles they bought with so much hope and excitement are rapidly becoming worthless. The rapid rise in used car prices was only the beginning of what would become a massive industry-wide collapse. Now, the flood of cars hitting the market and the inevitable destruction of vehicle values is becoming painfully clear. But what exactly is causing this sharp drop in prices? It's not just a matter of supply and demand. The true source of this catastrophe lies in a series of interlocking events that have left the automotive industry teetering on the edge of disaster. First and foremost, we have to look at the massive increase in rental car fleet sales. For years, rental car companies like Enterprise, Hertz, and Avis struggled during the pandemic as travel came to a standstill. With fewer tourists and business trips, the rental car giants were left with large inventories of vehicles that were hardly used, sitting in parking lots and collecting dust. In 2021, as the world began to recover, these companies began rebuilding their fleets, buying vehicles at an unprecedented rate. What they didn't foresee, however, was how quickly demand for rentals would drop off once travel returned to normal. By the first half of 2023, these companies had stockpiled over 2 million vehicles. Vehicles that had suddenly become a liability. With an overstocked fleet and diminishing demand, rental car companies began aggressively offloading their cars. In some cases, they were dumping as many as 20,000 vehicles in a single month. To make matters worse, they weren't just selling old models. They were getting rid of almost new vehicles with only a few thousand miles on them. A shocking example came when Hertz offloaded 1,200 SUVs in just a single week in March 2023, leading to a catastrophic 20% drop in the value of those vehicles overnight. Dealers who had paid top dollar for those same cars were suddenly staring at massive losses. The impact of this wasn't just felt by the rental companies, but rippled across the market, forcing prices down for virtually every vehicle on the lot. Meanwhile, the second major wave of destruction was coming from the lease returns. Between 2020 and 2022, a record number of consumers leased cars, encouraged by low monthly payments and the assumption that vehicle values would continue to climb. Many of these leases were based on inflated residual values, the price that consumers were expected to pay for the car at the end of the lease. These predictions weren't just slightly off, they were wildly unrealistic. Take, for example, a 2021 Chevrolet Silverado, which had a residual value of $45,000 at the end of its 3-year lease. However, by the time the lease expired in 2023, the same truck was only worth $32,000, a $13,000 gap. Multiply that scenario by millions of vehicles, and you can begin to understand why dealerships and banks were scrambling to absorb the losses. With more than 50,000 off-lease vehicles flooding the market every week, car dealers found themselves overwhelmed with inventory. The glut of cars didn't just hurt used car prices, it sent them into a freefall. In some areas, dealers were practically giving away vehicles just to get them off their lots, resulting in massive price reductions and putting downward pressure on the entire market. The situation worsened in cities like Houston, where dealerships were seeing lease returns skyrocket. One Texas dealership reported that their used car prices had fallen by as much as 25% in just 3 months due to the surge in off-lease vehicles. But even this wasn't the worst of it. The third wave, and perhaps the most devastating, came from repossessions. The pandemic might have given people a temporary cushion, but it also created a false sense of financial security. As federal relief programs ended and economic pressures mounted, more and more consumers found themselves unable to keep up with their auto loans. By mid-2023, almost 4% of all car loans were reported as delinquent, the highest rate since the 2008 financial crisis. In some cases, subprime borrowers, those with the highest risk of default, were walking away from vehicles they couldn't afford, leaving behind cars that were quickly repossessed and sent to auction. The impact was catastrophic. Repossession rates soared by 35% in the first quarter of 2023 alone. And here's where the real damage began. Repossessed vehicles, which were often newer and more expensive than their counterparts, were flooding the market at an alarming rate. In just 1 month, over 126,000 repossessed vehicles were auctioned off across the country. Many of these cars were sold at a fraction of their original value, further depressing an already saturated market. Dealers who had bought vehicles at top dollar during the boom years were now finding themselves saddled with cars worth far less than what they had paid for them. For instance, a 2022 Ford F-150 that had been sold for $55,000, 0 cents, just months earlier, was now being sold at auction for only $38,000, 0 cents. Creating massive losses for anyone who had purchased it at a higher price. These three forces, the massive dump of rental cars, the flood of off-lease vehicles, and the surge in repossessions, have combined to create a perfect storm that is pushing used car values down faster than anyone anticipated. The math is staggering. With over 200,000 vehicles hitting the market every single week, prices are dropping like a stone, and the industry is struggling to absorb the losses. It's not just a minor correction, it's a full-on collapse that threatens to send shockwaves throughout the entire economy. As this flood of vehicles continues to swell, the question remains: how long can the market survive before the crash is irreversible? The situation is already dire, and unless something drastic changes, millions of consumers, dealers, and lenders will find themselves left holding the bag when the tide finally recedes. The automotive market is on the brink, and it's only a matter of time before the damage becomes truly catastrophic. The devastating effects of the used car market collapse are starting to become undeniable. And for millions of consumers, this isn't just a financial setback, it's a catastrophe. The flood of rental vehicles, lease returns, and repossessions might be the primary drivers of the collapse, but what's truly concerning is the toll it's taking on car owners, dealerships, and the entire auto ecosystem. As prices plummet, many consumers are discovering the hard way that the vehicle they thought was a valuable asset is now a massive financial liability. The so-called equity they thought they had in their cars is evaporating before their eyes. And for some, the consequences are so severe that they're facing life-changing financial ruin. One of the most painful outcomes of the current collapse is the dramatic increase in negative equity. For years, many car buyers have been told that cars would retain their value or even increase in worth. This myth, perpetuated by car dealerships, auto lenders, and even consumers themselves, now feels like a cruel joke. Many people who bought cars just 2 or 3 years ago are finding themselves in deep trouble. They're stuck with vehicles worth tens of thousands less than what they owe, and the situation is only getting worse. Take, for example, a man named Robert from Texas who bought a 2021 Ford F-150 for $60,000 0 cents with a 72-month loan. He was told by the dealer that the truck would hold its value and that it was a sound investment. Fast forward to 2023, and Robert finds himself in a nightmare. His truck, once worth $60,000 0 cents, is now barely worth $35,000 0 cents. He owes $45,000 0 cents on it, and now he can't even sell it to pay off the loan. The negative equity has trapped him, and there's no way out. And Robert is not alone. Thousands of other car owners are facing the same dire situation. Those who bought at the height of the market are now seeing their loans outstrip the actual value of their vehicles, leaving them unable to trade in or sell their cars without incurring a significant loss. This situation has become so widespread that it's starting to impact families in ways that go beyond just the financial realm. Take, for instance, the story of Sarah from Ohio, a single mother who bought a 2022 Honda CR-V for $40,000 0 cents after a lengthy, hard-fought negotiation. She was told by the dealership that the vehicle would hold its value for years and that she could always sell it at a good price when the time came. But now, barely 18 months later, Sarah's car is worth just $28,000 0 cents. She owes $35,000 0 cents on it, and the dealership is offering her only $22,000 0 cents on trade-in. This has left her feeling trapped, unsure of what to do next. Sarah's financial stability, which was built around the idea that her car was an asset, is now crumbling as she faces an uphill battle to pay off a vehicle that no longer holds any real value. It's not just car owners who are being left in the lurch. Independent dealers, who have long depended on the steady flow of used car sales, are feeling the squeeze as well. These small dealerships, which were once thriving during the pandemic thanks to high demand and inflated prices, are now struggling to stay afloat as the market crashes. Many of them bought up vehicles at the peak of the market, hoping to sell them for a profit, only to find that their inventory has lost value so rapidly that they can't even break even. Take the case of Jason, an independent dealer in Florida. He had been in the business for over 15 years, but when the market exploded in 2021, he thought he could capitalize on the boom. Jason bought a batch of 2020 Toyota Camrys for $23,000 0 cents each, assuming they would continue to appreciate in value. Now in 2023, he's trying to sell them for $18,000 0 cents, and no one is buying. The cars are just sitting on his lot, accumulating dust and losing value by the day. Jason is not the only one. Across the country, independent dealers are finding themselves unable to sell their vehicles, with some even being forced to close their doors due to the rapid devaluation of their inventory. The impact on car dealerships doesn't stop there. Major dealerships, which were once flush with cash thanks to high car prices, are also struggling. Many large dealerships are sitting on inventory that has dropped in value by 15–20% in just a few months. For instance, a large dealership in Phoenix had purchased 500 used cars for an average price of $35,000 each just 6 months ago. Today, those same cars are worth just $28,000, 0 cents, leaving the dealership with a massive loss. And the situation is only getting worse. With repossessions flooding the market, dealerships are finding it increasingly difficult to turn a profit. What's worse, many consumers are no longer interested in buying cars at these inflated prices. The higher interest rates that banks are offering on car loans are also making it harder for buyers to afford new vehicles, driving demand for used cars even lower. As a result, many dealerships are now resorting to desperate measures, such as slashing prices just to get vehicles off their lots. But even with these price reductions, it's not enough to save them from the massive losses they're incurring.